Well, a little bit about me. Obviously, sort of got a diverse sort of background in IT. Sort of head up the infrastructure side at Conetix, so all of the servers and sort of software side. Sort of written a book on Nginx as well recently, and just to show that I'm not all IT, I'm actually a certified beer judge as well. So looking forward to the after party to have a beer as well. So obviously been in IT for 20 years, I reckon I've probably nearly seen more errors than Stack Overflow at times. So hopefully what I can share with you today is some of the tips and some of the ways to go about diagnosing problems with WordPress when things go wrong. So this talk will mostly be sort of aimed at developers and agency sort of levels, but there's quite a bit that's applicable to business owners and sort of small hobbyists as well. So we're going to start with the basics and then sort of work our way through to the more complex problems. So I'd like all of the problems always to be simple, not always the case, but just a quick thing before we get started, a quick reminder. If there's one quick takeaway I can give you from a hosting perspective is to make sure you have a backup of your website. The amount of times we've seen where developers don't have a backup or the client has made changes where the developer themselves doesn't have a backup before that point in time. So if you're always maintaining your backups and got an independent copy, you'll put yourself in a much better position than what a lot of people unfortunately find themselves in. So normally if you're in agency sort of work and developer sort of work, how you usually find out there's a problem. It normally starts with the customer. There's the angry phone call, my website's down, don't you know I'm losing thousands and thousands of dollars here, you know, what are you guys doing? Which normally then results in additional management assistance. So you're trying to diagnose a problem, but you've got a cast of thousands over your desk saying, have you found out what it is yet? Have you fixed the problem yet? You know, what's going on? Why is this broken? Whereas what you're normally facing is the software equivalent of this. So you've got to unravel this enormous mess. You don't know where to start, you've got problems, and you know, you've got the equivalent of trying to find the red wire amongst this to repatch and fix. Whereas what you really need is a nice calm environment. Everything burning around you, but nice focused sort of on the topic at hand. So hopefully what we'll go through is a little bit of a path to Zen. And so from what I see and from a WordPress sort of hosting perspective, this is how I think it's best sort of organised. So we start with the preparation side. We start with monitoring. There's normally quite a bit of diagnostics that go on when there are issues, and this is where we'll focus the talk on. And then hopefully you reach that nice Zen point where you're nice and calm when things do go wrong. So preparation. Obviously, customer calling to tell you the website is down isn't always the best way to find out things have gone wrong. So having a known state to compare to is, if you're managing WordPress sites, you know, what are the plugins installed and what versions are they? Has the customer gone and installed something, or have they employed a little freelancer to, you know, tweak one or two things on the site and he's ended up installing another 20 plugins for you? Known PHP errors and warnings. There are actually errors all the time, most of them hopefully just as warnings, but if you don't know your sort of steady state of what's going on beforehand, you're not quite sure afterwards, you know, is this related to the problem or unrelated? So it's just a little bit of preparation work. One nice ability, and a plugin we use sort of heavily as well, is Stream. So Stream allows you to track changes that are made in WordPress, and that's everything from installing plugins to adding media, editing posts, turning things on and off, changing settings. So it's a free plugin, gives you a nice sort of interface, which looks like this. So Stream gives you a view to see what's sort of going on. So you can see in this example, somebody's gone and installed the WooCommerce Gutenberg products block. So if you're having issues with a site where layouts have changed or something's sort of gone wrong, you can start to diagnose where it's occurring. You can also see when they've actually made the change. So you can see whether it's unrelated to the issue that you're having, because if it's only happened in the last 10 minutes or 5 minutes, you sort of know when the change was actually made, rather than just seeing a new plugin installed. And of course, you can see who actually made this action. So hopefully, of course, you've got individual unique usernames for everybody that logs into the system to make it nice and easy to trace back down to who it was. Monitoring. So the other key bit, of course, you don't want the customer to be calling to let you know the website is down. So a simple thing is that forearmed is forewarned. If you know there are issues coming or you know that a site's down, you can actually start on the problem straight away. One very important thing is, because we're based in Australia, is to make sure that the system you're using for monitoring has a point of presence here in Australia. And this is very important because Australia's internet connectivity to the rest of the world, and especially to the States, can be quite broken at times. So 2 systems, these are just one of many that definitely do have points of presence in Australia, StatusCake and Panopta. You do have to use the paid products for StatusCake to get the Australian monitoring, but it's well worth to see, in advance when your sites are having issues and have an independent view of what's actually, when your site is up and down. So just as a bit of a cable map of Australia, we really only have 2 main points that sort of come out for internet connectivity. And what this diagram doesn't quite show is these grey lines, they're all planning to come. So the Perth cable was cut 3 times in the last 12 months, which means all of the traffic ends up flowing out of the Sydney sort of connections. Because bandwidth is, of course, expensive and limited when it's overseas sort of cables, there were intermittent issues all the time for a number of months until they repair the break in the cable. So diagnostics, this is the fun bit. This is a bit that, hopefully you can walk away with learning something today. So when we have a nice catastrophic error, we either get a 500 page or we get the WordPress white screen of death. This is what I consider a hard failure, and while it is a bad thing, they're normally the easiest sort of to diagnose. So always the first point of call for when your site has an error is to have a look at the server logs. So if you're running cPanel or you're running Plesk, you don't need server access, but you can actually see the error logs at Apache or PHP, and essentially where WordPress is having issues, we'll be spitting those out. So within cPanel, within the metrics sort of area, there's the errors button, and that'll take you to the next screen to show you the errors that are occurring. Within Plesk, they have a centralised area for logs as well. So you've got a really quick way of going in and having a look to see what's actually going on with your site. So let's have a bit of a look in the logs. Got an example. Obviously, there was a catastrophic error, so we can't even see any warning messages. We're either just getting a 500 sort of server error, or we're getting the white screen of death. So what's actually going on here? And this is what your logs essentially should look like from an error log perspective. And so you can see in this example, we've got a PHP fatal error. So it couldn't even complete running the code to spit out a result. And that's why you're getting a white screen of death, or you're getting a server error sort of saying it couldn't even get to the point where it'll display something on the screen. You can see where it's occurring. So you can see in this example, we've got Tim's Shady plugin. And of course, it'll even tell us down to line 13 and sort of give us a stack trace of what's going on. But what you can do is, if you're having an issue with a plugin, obviously it'll identify which plugin is causing a fatal error. And when you see the line, you can actually go and have a look at the code as well to see what's being called and what may be conflicting. So in this example, you can see on line 13, Tim's gone and written and thrown an exception. So of course, it's crashing the site hard. So you can sort of go from a site not working to going, okay, this is a plugin I need to disable. So we find about 80% of all issues are identified just by looking at the logs. You may not be able to solve them instantly, they may be more convoluted than that longer term, but looking at the log files and seeing when those errors occur and what the error is, this is normally where 80% of that is identified. If you have a lot of sites, so it's nice and easy when you've got 1 or 2 sites to jump in and look at the logs, but if you're running hundreds of sites, what you really want is a centralised sort of logging platform. And the reason for that is it can give you historical views, you can do a search. If you're updating multiple sites and updating a plugin broke one site, then the chances are it's probably going to break 20 other sites as well. So you can use a centralised logging platform to search all of your sites and therefore identify a list that you need to go and correct. So two quick examples of centralised logging platforms is Papertrail, which is a software as a service platform. Essentially you can just stream your logs at them, pay them to index and have a nice sort of search system. Or Greylog is a common one if you want to host it yourself. So you can point quite a bit of information at either one of those, and it just depends on how much you want to manage yourself versus having somebody else manage the logging side for you. So to give you a snapshot, this is from one of our sort of centralised sort of logging platforms. Even within a 24-hour day, because of the amount of warnings that PHP will generate, we see upwards of 800,000, sometimes 7 to 8 million sort of logs sort of going through it a day. What a centralised system also gives you is we can obviously see when errors are occurring and we can see anomalies. So in this breakdown we had per PHP version, so we could see is it only occurring on certain versions. We also had by host, so we could see is it just one server that's causing this issue or is it multiple servers? So having a centralised platform just gives you that bigger insight into what's going on. So obviously hard errors, hard failures, I love them because they're the easy ones to find. The soft errors or soft failures, they're always the harder ones to try and diagnose. And by a soft failure I mean something like, you normally get a nice descriptive, my site is slow to load, or 2 out of 5,000 products in my WooCommerce store are having issues. Or my site seems slower this month. We get, my site works perfectly, but when I'm in the WordPress admin, it's taking forever to do something. So the next point of call, you can go to these, WordPress has a debugging sort of option built in. Obviously highly recommended while you're in the development phase to see more of what's going on with your system. But it's a good way to see some of those soft failures as well. So like the 2 products out of my 5,000 are having an issue. And the reason it gives us sort of more information is the standard sort of PHP and sort of WordPress logging levels. We normally see errors and warnings on most systems. But when we turn the WordPress debug on, we get notices as well. So they're not necessarily things that are going to cause a catastrophic error to your site. But if you've got potential where there's a little bit of a conflict and you can't quite work out where it is, turning on this debug level will give you more information again. To turn on WordPress debugging, if you've got most of the managed sort of WordPress tools, give you a nice easy button. This one was a screenshot from Plesk. Or you can go and hand edit your config as well. So all we have to define is the variable wp config is true. We tell wp debug log, which will log it to a file. And just in case you were running it on a production system, we define wp debug display and set that to false. So basically what that means is the end user won't see the errors on their screen. So by default, this will just log a file and to wp content debug.log. And so you can see in this example there was no errors, like there weren't fatal errors, there weren't warnings. This particular example just had an undefined index in country sort of thing for one of the WooCommerce plugins. So if you were having an issue where most of the products were working but the two where you have a geo filter on or something where the price changes per country, this at least allows you to drill down and see, hey, maybe there's something going on with this plugin and I need to look at it further. So diving a little deeper, obviously skimming over the top of the logs and bits and pieces gives us a reasonable amount of information, but not everything can be easily diagnosed. So before we go on to these steps, obviously my reminder again to make sure you have a backup. So these changes in the presentation sort of here on in, you're going to be installing plugins and sort of making changes to the system. So always take a backup first, and then hopefully too you've got a staging or development environment that you can run some of this stuff on. So if there's no errors in the logs, where do you sort of look next? One plugin we use to do that is Query Monitor. So Query Monitor again is an open source and free plugin, and basically it'll give you a lot more information about what's going on with your WordPress website. So it'll show you down to the database queries that are run. It'll show you the WordPress hooks that are being called. It'll show you the templates being used and some of the template hierarchy. It'll show you the HTTP calls that WordPress is making out to other sites for information. And there's a whole lot of other tools that are sort of built into it as well. So this is, once you've installed Query Monitor, you can see up in the top sort of bar, you get this extra little bit of information. So by default, it won't display a lot of information, but you can see it's already giving you a visual indicator. This page took 0.06 seconds to actually sort of load the site. So this is fresh out of the box 2017, so everything's super quick, no plugins installed. We've only used 3.8 megs of memory. Database queries only took 0.003 seconds. So the database isn't slowing things up here. And there's only 19 database queries, to render the page. So instantly we get a lot more sort of feedback on what's going on with the page. So from the database perspective, it'll break down to the queries that were run. So you can actually see, down to which queries are taking what time. So if it's one particular query that is slow, that's causing a site slowdown, you can see what it is and even down to which component called it. So if it was a plugin calling it, you can see which plugin is actually calling that. The template side. So obviously with WordPress's template hierarchy at times, knowing which bit is actually manipulating, the problem that you're seeing on the screen. So you get a full breakdown of the template hierarchy and the parts that it's using to build up your template to render the site. And of course, HTTP calls. So in this example, we can see 2 quick calls out to Jetpack, as well as a call to the WordPress Browse Happy, just checking your browser version. So some plugins, some premium plugins we see, their calls may be synchronous and therefore blocking. And if their system is down, then it can take up to 30 seconds to sort of load your site at times because it has to wait for a timeout to occur. When you've got Query Monitor installed, you can actually see what that query is and where it's going. So an example with seeing the WordPress hooks. So a common one is where a plugin developer has thought, hey, I should include a copy of jQuery myself, and of course you're now getting a conflict on the main site because there's 2 copies loaded. So with the hook side, we can have a look at the WP and Q scripts, and we can actually see the hierarchy of what's loading the plugins, what's loading the scripts, or sort of enqueuing scripts, and we get this build-up of what's actually adding things in here. So if we're looking for an issue, we know a new plugin's been installed, is it enqueuing scripts that it shouldn't be? We can start to diagnose that fairly quickly. A simple, what's the impact of installing WooCommerce? So obviously out of the box, WordPress is nice and fast. What's a lightweight WooCommerce sort of cost in terms of server performance these days? So you can see we went from 0.06 seconds sort of page load time out to 0.2 seconds, which is still very good. Our sort of memory has increased 3-fold to do so. Database queries are gone from 13 to 92. So we can start to sort of measure the impact of installing plugins, installing new features, and sort of see the difference before and after. If you get a nice simple, my WordPress admin is slower. Page load times for the main site are nice and quick, but the user's complaining every time they're doing an action in the back end, it's taking forever to do so. So you can see in this example, it took 2.2 seconds to actually render the WordPress admin. Database queries were nice and quick, even though there was more of them. So there must be something else sort of going on. So in this example, we had a look at the HTTP calls. And obviously when you're in the WordPress admin, at times it will refresh the metadata for plugins. For this particular example, obviously the 2 seconds extra page load time was actually WordPress itself getting the latest copy of all the metadata for the plugins. For some premium plugins we've seen, because they don't have the same amount of redundancy as WordPress.org, they may be doing maintenance schedule for their sort of plugin site. So the external call, being Australia, business hours for us, of course, is generally maintenance hours for a lot of US and sort of European countries. So they do it at 2 in the morning, thinking it won't impact anybody. But of course, here in Australia, we run into troubles there. So it's just always worth sort of checking. So let's go deeper again. We need to go all the way into the wormhole. We need to see the real belly of WordPress and what's going on. So just a warning, these examples, you'll probably require root access to your server, or hopefully you're running this on your localized development environment and therefore not impacting any of your production systems. So first option is XDebug. So XDebug is an extension for PHP and basically it just assists with debugging. So it'll give you a single sort of step developer and it'll sort of all of the function calls and it'll build them in using a profiler and give you an output of what's actually going on for your site. So if you've developed WordPress plugins and sort of played around with the actual PHP code and wondered what the performance impact is, you can now start to measure and see some of this. So we'll just focus quickly on the profiler just to give you an overview. But of course, speaking today, we have Alex at 2 o'clock who will take you through the whole process of what XDebug can do for your WordPress development and debugging as well. So a quick little example of how to use sort of XDebug. Hopefully it's already compiled in for your local development environment or you've already had it installed on your server. So you just need to make sure in the PHP sort of ini file that the extension is loaded. We're going to set the profiler up to act off a trigger. So we set that to 1 and we're just going to give it a trigger value of WordCamp test. So to run the profiler, all we need to do is essentially call the trigger. So we get the, my WordPress site is, my website is slow. So we can actually capture via the profiler what's going on. So you can see in this example, it took 7.7 seconds to render the site. Memory usage was 11 megs, so it's not too bad. Database queries were 0.006 seconds. So we know it's not a huge amount of database or a database time that's causing the site slowdown. So basically it means it's somewhere within the code where we're seeing slowdowns. So to call the profiler, all we need to do is use the trigger. So we do, with the get sort of variable, the x sort of debug profile, and we use our trigger value of WordCamp test. And what this will actually do is record all of the functions that were called and store this in a file that you can analyze. So by default, it'll spit it out somewhere to say /temp, but what you're looking for is a case grind sort of file that it'll spit out. There's then a number of tools that you can load this in. So for a Windows environment, you've got QCacheGrind. If you want to load it via a web interface, you've got WebGrind. Or if you've got an IDE that's got advanced sort of editing tools, like PHP Storm, they have the sort of XDebug stuff built in as well. So just to give you an example, this is a call stack of what's actually going on in the background when WordPress is sort of rendering your site. So you can see 72% of the time was spent in apply filters. So something was calling a hook. We can see, again, 72% of this time was this excellent coding function that's caused the slowdown. And of course, for some reason, we can see 100 calls to the PHP password hash. So we can now go back into that excellent coding plugin, and we can see that for some reason, this crazy programmer has decided to put a for loop in and create a password hash sort of 100 times over. So we can see down to the code that's actually causing the issue. Your example may be down to a function call that is iterating over thousands or even millions of objects and trying to manipulate them to spit out one thing. But at least you'll see down to what level and where this is actually occurring. And yeah, probably shouldn't let this guy near an editor again. So again, if you want to see more of what XDebug can do and how you can incorporate it into your environment, make sure you come along and see Alex's talk just after 2. The other option is, if you want to see what's going on behind the scenes, is one example is New Relic. So New Relic have an APM, which is an application performance management system. So it just gives you a complete overview and sort of complete view of what your application is actually doing. So this is loaded at a server level and hooks into PHP. And basically they've got 3 different versions with their APM. So the pricing does vary based on whether what cloud provider you're with, or the base sort of pricing. They've got a Lite version that they don't tell you about. They have an Essentials version which has a number of WordPress features sort of built in, and they have a Pro version that's more advanced functionality again. So there are other APMs sort of available. So if you're looking for this functionality and this isn't in your price range, make sure you sort of have a look to see what's available out there. So just to quickly go through what New Relic has, the Lite interface, we get an overview. So this is taken from a real sort of website. We can see throughput rate, we can see what's occurring, so we can see the majority of the time sort of rendering this site is spent in PHP. We can see that our database queries are low, and that there are a few external sort of calls causing delays as well, but there's nothing that sort of stands out. We can also sort by what's the slowest average response time. So thinking of, that my admin area is slow. We can then sort of see down to the breakdown table. So you can see in this example, it was taking 24 seconds to render the WordPress admin site. And it was when they were uploading an image, it was taking 17 seconds to run it through Smush It. So although uploading the image itself only took sort of 6 seconds, there was then another sort of 17 or 18 seconds it's taking to before the user sort of sees output again. In the Essentials version, so the paid version, you can now start to see down to hooks. So you can see which hooks over time are sort of building up. You can see where they're sort of being called. You can see plugins and themes. So it'll actually give you a breakdown of, and you can sort by the most time consuming. So you can see which plugins are causing you the most performance sort of impact and which sort of, if you switch themes, what's going on there. You can see the database queries. So although Query Monitor can show you this information as well, Query Monitor is obviously just one point in time. If you know that every 9 o'clock every morning my site is slow, it allows you to go back historically to have a look and see what's going on. So that sort of gives you an overview, but 2 real quick get-out-of-jail-free cards. 2 errors we see that crop up from time to time and can be a nightmare to diagnose or don't quite sort of stand out initially. First one is always check your WP options table, especially for expired transients. This isn't the worst example we've seen, it's just one I saw in the last week, so I could take a screenshot of. So WordPress obviously stores information, WooCommerce has transients, and in this instance, it has stored nearly 2 million rows into the WP options table. So every time you're loading a page, it's having to load this information in and causing enormous performance issues, of course, for the website. And always check your WordPress core files. The amount of times where we've seen where there's been an incomplete sort of upload via FTP, or one file has been missed in an update in terms of when somebody's manually run an update. So if you use the WordPress CLI tools, you can do a quick WP core verify checksums. And that'll actually verify that all the files in the core are actually there and the right version of and all complete. So just to summarise, just remember your path to Zen. Make sure you've got your preparation sorted for your site. Make sure you've got some monitoring there so you can know beforehand what's going on. Know where your diagnostics sort of tools are, and then hopefully you have a nice, smooth sort of transition when errors occurs. Obviously, because most of the errors are sort of identified within your logs, make sure you find where your server log files are located. And the reason is you want to familiarise yourself with these tools before you actually need them. You don't need to cast the thousands over your desk as you're trying to learn how these things work. And one last reminder again, of course, make sure you have a backup. Everything is normally recoverable, of course, if you can just roll back to before some of these changes were made or before somebody broke the site on your behalf. And we'll open up to questions.
I'm going to run around with the mic, so if anyone has a question, maybe pop your hand in the air so I can see you and bring you the microphone so that the video can pick up the question and so that everyone can hear you. Any takers?
Hi, just a really quick question about the backups. cPanel backups, full cPanel backups, or what do you recommend there?
Yeah, so for backup-wise, we recommend using a WordPress-specific tool, and the reason is it can take a point-in-time sort of snapshot and make sure it's packaged up and can run further sort of checks sort of there. So there's obviously a number of plugins available. There's the Backup Buddy, Updraft Plus. They can normally too also incorporate sending them off-site so that you have a copy away from your hosting environment as well.
So they are okay. Backup those two.
Yeah, so they're probably the most common two plugins we see, and both of them, yeah, certainly work well. So there's Backup Buddy and Updraft Plus, the two that we see, I guess, as the most common. So if you're using a managed sort of WordPress environment and they have specific backup tools available as well, then obviously they're okay as well. But it's always good to have the application sort of controlling the backup as well.
With the expired transients, are they completely useless if you see them in the database? And is it easy to kind of find them and delete them?
In most instances, yes. They're meant to be for a period of time. So say if you're browsing a WooCommerce sort of site, it's generally, especially in older versions of WooCommerce where people haven't upgraded, there's meant to be a separate sort of cron or a background sort of system running to clean them up. So if you're browsing a site and you want to be able to customise things, they can be stored in a sort of transient sort of data so that as you're browsing the site, your session information is stored and it can customise the products tailored to you. But obviously once you've left the site, they're no longer any good, so they should be cleaned up. But the amount of times we've seen where plugins also that store information, not just WooCommerce, that's just one example, store it in the WP options table and suddenly there's gigabytes of data that you don't require.
So you could just do a search for expired transients and just delete the whole lot, it wouldn't break anything?
Shouldn't break anything, I won't. Of course you have a backup before you delete any of those.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, in most instances we normally just clear those transients out. So there are plugins to help identify that as well. But it's one little gotcha that, you know, if you're looking at why is this site performing slow, unless you're sort of looking at tables and looking at why it's going on, we see it enough times that, yeah, it's a common issue.
One question over here.
Thank you. Hi, just a question in relation to the staging environment. So for example, you have a live situation where something goes wrong on the production side and you want to put things on the staging environment, fix it up and push it back. Do you have an example of what is the best practice, how it should be done?
Yeah, so depending on what your hosting environment is like, so each environment is generally different. We sort of predominantly use, or sort of only use the Plesk sort of base environment. So it has a one-click staging option. So we can spin up a staging sort of version, make changes, and it also has a synchronise button back. And I know a lot of the other managed providers also have something similar. So you can take a copy of the site, work on it. When you're happy with it, you can synchronise that back to your production sort of site. But hopefully if you've found an issue, you're able to roll back that production site while you work on the issue and give yourself more time to sort of re-upload any of those changes.
So, just what happens in between the time that you're actually found the problem, you've fixed it, in between those two time gaps, your site is still live and it's being used, being updated?
Yes,
how do you solve that problem?
So obviously if you've been caught out where you know, somebody else has made a change, you can either roll back a backup of the site so that you can quickly restore to a known point in time. But that can become more difficult if you're running an e-commerce sort of platform. So hopefully you've got a nice answer where you can roll back to a known sort of point and then sort of diagnose and figure out what's going on. So you can take a copy of that sort of running version that has issues and then roll back your production version and then hopefully then focus your time while it's not panic stations to diagnose the problems.
If there are any other questions, wave your hand.
Yeah, so the question was whether you can roll back while it's live. So most systems, yeah, will allow you to restore a backup over the top. So there will be at some point, some period where obviously as files are being overwritten and the database is being overwritten where the site won't be available. But if you're facing a hard error, then obviously that's you know, much more prevalent to have a short downtime than just to be displaying a white screen of death or errors to the user.
Are there any further questions for Tim at this stage? I have one. You spoke at the beginning about having the client breathing down your neck while you're trying to troubleshoot. Have you got any top tips for how to deal with that particular aspect of debugging? Yeah,
that particular aspect is hopefully you've got a nice team around you that can shield you from the customer. Hopefully you got some geographic distance. That makes it harder for them to literally breathe down your neck. But yeah, so having trust in your team, having them sort of field the calls and allowing whoever's working on the problem, give them enough isolation so they can actually focus on the issue at hand.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Tim, for giving us that lecture.